Without Lucky Luciano, organized crime as we know it today would not exist.
You look at him and he has just those dead eyes. There's no soul in Lucky Luciano at all.
I think he was a psychopathic killer.
Fear and the ruthlessness that it took to induce fear was the basis of Lucky Luciano's power.
He was a leader. Those things that make men defer to another man, he had them.
Lucky Luciano was probably the most prominent godfather in organized crime in the United States.
I think it's all summed up in a name, though. They didn't call him Lucky for nothing.
Lucky Luciano, founding father of organized crime, or just a shrewd American businessman who saw an opportunity and grabbed it? A man so evil that he deserved to be locked up for the rest of his life? Or was he simply the not-so-innocent target of a crusading prosecutor with political ambition? Was he a patriot whose valuable help during World War II got him released from prison? Who was the real Lucky Luciano?
Rogues Gallery is narrated by William Devane.
The term Godfather conjures up images of machine guns and blood feuds, bootleg whiskey and murder, loan sharks, extortion, bribery, mayhem, and corruption. Tentacles that reach out from the rackets into legitimate enterprise. The images are now as familiar as they are cliched. However, what is undeniably true is that the key to the success of any business has always been organization. Organization means money. Money buys power. At the beginning of the 20th century, crime is plentiful, petty, and disorganized. Violence, bloodshed, and thievery are all common, and so are the criminals. And then along comes a man who, like a force of nature, organizes crime in America. Ironically, that awesome force has the most humble of origins.
Charlie Lucky Luciano was born in Sicily in 1897 and spent his first 8 years there, and then joined the general procession of Italian immigration to America.
When Lucky Luciano would have been a young boy growing up in New York City, you would have seen that the term melting pot was a great big lie. It was no melting pot. It was isolated enclaves. Lucky grew up in a small Italian enclave which rested on the edge of a huge Jewish ghetto made up of 1.5 people.
People living in fire traps, 10, 15 people to a room. Lucky if they had a coal stove in the middle of a room to keep them warm, eating out of garbage cans. It was a terrible existence, which is one of the reasons why so many of these people drifted into some kind of life of crime in order to survive.
America is fast becoming an industrial machine, and these immigrants are just cheap labor. They are at the bottom rung of the American dream.
So it was hard work for very, very little money. That was what the paved streets of gold of the United States were offering to people like Lucky. And unlike my father and a lot of other immigrants who had come from Italy, he spurned the pick and shovel. And he said, I'm going to do it a better way, a faster way.
Who had money that they saw? The guy who was selling narcotics to somebody, the guy who was robbing people. So who were you going to emulate?
So the kind of rackets that Charlie got into as a teenager in New York in the 19-teens, they were small-time local stuff. Burglaries, larcenies, stick-ups, some dope dealing. His first arrest at the age of 18 was for dealing heroin, for example. Pretty small stuff.
He is on his way to a life of seemingly easy money. But clearly, at this point, Lucky is no more than a street punk.
One of the keys to Lucky's ultimate climb up the ladder of organized crime is that he's in touch with non-Italians. Most of the Italian gangsters of his time just stayed among Italian groups.
But he grew up in an area largely surrounded by Jewish immigrants. I think that that is what contributed to the fact that he had an affinity for and a friendship with other Jewish young men. And that's how Meyer Lansky and Ben Siegel became two of his closest associates for the rest of their lives.
And the story that both of them later told was how one day in the street, Lansky on his own was met by a crowd of Italian boys headed by this tough Charles Luciano. And Lansky told them to get lost, and that he, small though he was, wasn't going to be pushed around.
Something immediately clicks between Luciano and Lansky, and a partnership is formed. They discover that their talents complement each other perfectly, like a marriage.
The issue of the marriage was the 3 M's: moxie, muscle, and money. In the future, the Jews would continue to provide the moxie, the Italians would provide the muscle, and they would split the money.
Lansky was the brain. Luciano was the administrator. And Luciano was the man who could take Lansky's conceptions and make them real.
And there's a rapport between them. Bugsy Siegel later said that they were more than brothers, they were like lovers. They would complete each other's sentences. It was an unspoken thing. They just knew they were on the same wavelength. It's a very important partnership, and Meyer Lansky becomes absolutely important to Charlie's future dealings as a gangster.
In 1919, Congress ratifies the 18th Amendment. It is supposedly done in the public interest, but this legislation actually is about to create a crime wave of extraordinary proportions. Will Charlie Lucky Luciano be able to find his place in this brave new world? January 1920, Prohibition becomes the law of the land. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol is now banned. However, if you can find some, you're allowed to drink it.
Prohibition is the best thing that ever happened to organized crime. It is the reason that organized crime, as we have known it ever since, exists on the national scale.
It was illegal to sell liquor. That didn't stop people from wanting to drink.
And everybody, pilgrim or pagan, is thirsty. All that is needed is a regular supply, kind of like the way milk is delivered, only it requires payoffs, cover of night, guns, and a willingness to kill. But unlike gambling or prostitution, which takes place locally, the importation of liquor will need international coordination and cooperation, and that's what gives rise to a crime syndicate.
It was a boon for the young criminals. What it did to a very large extent was take them out of their neighborhood communities.
Suddenly, the whole world opened up. They moved in very quickly. Luciano was young. He was still, early 20s. Lansky was this similar age. They would take the risks. They would drive the trucks that brought the booze in from Canada. They would operate the stills.
Bootlegging was the main activity for Luciano and Lansky in the 1920s. But gambling became an increasingly profitable part of it because, after all, gambling and drinking go together. The speakeasies often had gambling rooms along with the entertainment.
We compelled gangsters to learn how to be good businessmen. If they didn't learn to be good businessmen, they would not have survived in the Prohibition era.
By 1923, Luciano is a rising star in the New York underworld, making plenty of easy money and connections. But one day, his luck turns sour. He is picked up for dealing heroin and faces a stiff prison sentence.
The Mafia has this code, supposedly, that you don't inform on anyone, that you don't flip and testify against a fellow criminal to the cops, that you don't cooperate with law enforcement. But as a matter of fact, very early in Charlie's career, he does precisely this.
To save himself, Luciano informs on a Jewish drug dealer. Not only are all charges against him dropped, but the shrewd Luciano has also eliminated a competitor and has not technically violated the code. Flipping on a non-Italian is acceptable. By 1925, when the average American is earning $2 a day, Lucky and Lansky are raking in thousands of dollars a week.
And at that time, the Italian mobsters were beginning to organize. The Maranzano faction and the Masseria faction and the crime families were starting to develop.
So almost all the Italian gangsters in the greater New York area ended up in two groups. You're either with Masseria or Maranzano.
And Lucky took his chances. He teamed up with Masseria.
Luciano's rise is exceptionally swift. He begins to run all of Manhattan for Masseria. He makes some powerful enemies determined to teach him a lesson. One night, so the legend goes, Luciano is walking along 6th Avenue when he is abducted by several thugs and taken to Staten Island. They beat him savagely and leave him for dead. Miraculously, he lives, albeit with a drooping eye and a scar around his lip. He is fortunate just to be alive, and surviving the attack is supposedly what earns him the nickname Lucky.
Unfortunately for that legend, the police report on that incident says that he's already known as Charlie Lucky, has been known as Charlie Lucky for several years. My best guess is that it was a play on his name. Charlie Luciano becomes Lucky, if you just twist the word a little bit.
However he got the name, Luciano is clearly luckier than those holding stock in America's legitimate corporations. Only a few days after his terrible beating, the stock market crashes. It is the beginning of the Great Depression.
By that point, in the late 1920s, there was a recognition that Luciano was emerging as the guy who was the biggest threat to both Masseria and Maranzano.
Maranzano and Masseria were old world figures, still believed very much in the ways of the mafia in Italy. Luciano would not have subscribed to their feelings. They probably even resented his friendship with Siegel, with Lansky and other non-Italians.
And they were constantly at odds, constantly trying to take over the other's business, constantly killing each other's people, and so the factions continued to exist.
The old world ways and the gang war between Masseria and Maranzano are bad for business. If mob profits and power are to increase, the rivalry must end. So Luciano embarks on a risky course of action.
Masseria had no idea anything was going to happen to him. The story is that Charlie Lucky made a date with Joe in Coney Island in a restaurant there, late.
So that by the time they finished eating, most of the diners would have left the restaurant. And so we're finished eating, how about a little game of cards while we have an after-dinner drink? And they started playing cards.
And at a certain point, Luciano gets up and goes to the washroom. And just at that point, remarkably enough, in comes some killers and they kill Joe the Boss Masseria. Luciano is cool. I mean, he is cool. He doesn't flee the scene. He sticks around. The cops arrive, and Charlie Lucky is there to explain what happened. And he says, well, I don't know. I didn't see it. I was in the washroom when the shooters came in, and I'm very sorry that Joe the Boss is dead. Well, Charlie's the young upstart now. He has taken over the Masseria gang, and the main rival is the Maranzano gang. Salvatore Maranzano is an older man, a man of some culture and depth, and sees himself as the successor to Julius Caesar among great Italian leaders.
You would go into his studio, and there were busts of Julius Caesar everywhere. He read Caesar's Gallic Wars in Latin to his men.
And Luciano came to the conclusion, my God, we got rid of one despot, only to have him succeeded by another. This won't go. So he bided his time, and 6 months after Masseria was killed, it was decided that Maranzano had to go.
Well aware of what Lucky has done to Joe the Boss, Maranzano surrounds himself with formidable protection. But killing this self-styled successor to Julius Caesar will not be easy. His bodyguards know all of Lucky's men by sight, so Luciano asked for help to pull off one of gangland's greatest hits.
Luciano came up with a great idea. I turned to my friend Meyer Lansky, and I'm going to ask him to handle the hit of Maranzano.
September 11th, 1931. A group of U.S. Treasury agents arrive at Maranzano's offices near Grand Central Station and demand to inspect his financial records. Expecting hostile Italians, the guards feel they have nothing to fear from these men and usher them into the boss's inner sanctum. The phony T-men whip out guns and blow Maranzano to bits. The triggermen are probably members of the Siegel-Lansky mob. To this day, no one knows their actual identities, but legend has it that Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky, as a personal favor to their friend Lucky, are among those pulling the trigger.
Every 10 or 20 years, one of these wars break out. Everybody goes at it and kills everybody. Everybody realizes how destructive that is, and when the smoke clears, who's ever left standing is running the show.
The man left standing is Lucky Luciano, who now finds himself in the remarkable position of being one of the most powerful gangsters in America. But this is a violent world where the only thing certain is uncertainty. Will Lucky be able to stay on top? By the 1930s, Charlie Luciano is the top gangster in New York. He's eliminated Joe the Boss and Salvatore Maranzano. His vision has carried him to the top of the heap, and in unprecedented fashion, he has consolidated the power of the underworld.
What Luciano saw was that if you have power within your own territory, and you don't have to worry about somebody coming in and fighting you all the time for that power, and you don't go into somebody else's territory and fight him for his power, you're both going to succeed. The minute you start to fight each other within the territory, you're both going to fail. Profit comes from cooperation. Profit comes from unity.
What he did then, he took the 5 families in the New York area, and he said we should keep in touch with and cooperate with the boys in Cleveland, the boys in Chicago, Capone's group, and Detroit, and so on. And we should put this group all together. And from among the leadership of that group, we will have a national commission. If any little problem comes up between any 2 groups, the commission will hear the gripe and the complaint and come out with a fair decision that we will all abide with.
It will give the Mafia a national scope and unity and cohesion that it hasn't had before, really that no underworld gang has ever had in this country.
Luciano took this incredible bunch of lowlifes and with just smarts and guts, organized them in the most ruthless manner, commanding the respect of adversary and ally alike.
Remember, this is much like being in the army. There's going to be fear and violence. There's going to be messy jobs to be done. And to lead, you have to have the kind of aura that people will follow you into these kinds of battles.
He terrified people. He had the personal ability to stare people down.
He wouldn't tip his hand. You couldn't tell from his face what he was thinking. He would sit there and he would be polite, and other guys would be bouncing off the walls, and Charlie would just be sitting there in the middle, controlling it, everyone deferring to him as the first among equals.
And he was one thing that so many of the other Italian mobsters were not. He was not prejudiced. Luciano saw that if you worked with a Meyer Lansky, who was Jewish and who was a master manipulator of numbers, then you could make a lot of bridges, and suddenly organized crime would be run like a business, a corporation.
The only problem is that this corporation's main product is bootleg whiskey, which is about to disappear.
Prohibition passes out. At 35.5 minutes past 3 on December 5th, 1933, Utah becomes the 36th state to ratify the 21st Amendment, repealing the 18th. Beer is back. Not just 3.2, but real beer.
It's a new deal for all Americans, and organized criminals are no different. For the gangsters, diversification will be the key to survival. So from the docks to the garment industry, working both sides of labor, Luciano and Lansky used the enormous profits earned from the sale of bootleg liquor to expand their empire.
There is everything from the street-level staples, gambling, loan sharking, narcotics, put together by individual soldiers as a regular cash cow, to the more sophisticated and much more lucrative controls over unions, pension funds, labor unions beyond the Teamsters.
Anything that had a tinge of illegality to it, they were in. And one of the major things that they had were trucks. They had all these trucks that they'd been using to haul liquor. Now they had trucking companies.
It turned out to be a remarkably successful enterprise because within a decade or so, the mafia families in the United States were making more money than the 10 major industrial corporations combined.
And searching for further growth opportunities, Luciano and Lansky make their first investments in Cuba, establishing casinos and resort hotels. As befits the man who rules this criminal kingdom, Lucky embraces the high life. He rises late in the morning, does a little business over breakfast, and heads to the track in the afternoon where he indulges his passion for the ponies, betting $1,000 a race.
Lansky and Luciano operated in a cash economy. They always had a great deal of money in their pockets. That was how they operated. It was very easy for them to become big tippers and to get very fond of living high on the hog and the flash lifestyle.
Lucky loved the spotlight. He loved to get dressed up in a tuxedo and make the rounds of the clubs, all the places where gangsters went. He lived very prominently in the Waldorf Astoria Towers in a beautiful suite.
He's leading the life of a big spender, of going out with dozens of gorgeous showgirls and chorus girls, and making a tremendous splash around town, as if he was God Almighty.
If Broadway palled, his powerful private Lockheed plane would roar him away to Miami, Chicago, or Hot Springs, to be hailed there with open arms. He is the bookmaker's joy, the torch singer's delight, a Dracula masquerading as a good-time Charlie.
He's always involved in that sort of life. He likes being out in the world and being acknowledged as the great Lucky Luciano. He's rather too prominent.
You got to remember, there are egos on the other side also. Every prosecutor, every FBI agent, every police chief is going to look at a guy like that and say, well, I'm not interested in these other characters. I want the one who's on the front page all the time. I want the one that the newspapers talk about.
Fortunately for Lucky, the feds aren't interested in the mob. In fact, J. Edgar Hoover would continue to deny the existence of organized crime for the next 2 decades.
John Edgar Hoover avoided suggesting that La Cosa Nostra, organized crime, was a serious threat to the United States because then he'd be expected to do something about it.
Hoover, I think, knew that he couldn't get the mafia, so he left them alone because he only bit off chunks that he knew he could chew. He was always supposed to get his man.
The FBI's reluctance to take on organized crime doesn't stop New York State from tackling the problem. In 1935, the State Assembly passes the first anti-racketeering law and finds someone very special to enforce it.
Law enforcement cannot take a holiday in New York County. Tom, you've got to keep up this work.
For 20 years, the underworld has preyed on our people and robbed them, and then frightened them into silence. But now, the day of fear of the gangster is coming to an end.
Tom Dewey is an ambitious young prosecutor who came to New York in the 1920s from a small town in the Midwest. He is appalled by the corruption in the big city. This outrage fuels his work as a crusading racket buster.
Dewey was successful for a number of reasons. The principal one was the people he surrounded himself with. He picked some very bright young attorneys who believed in what he was going to do, and that was, let's get rid of corruption. Let's see if we can break up some of this tie-up between gangsters and politicians. They brought with it a natural zeal to see that that job would be done well. And he asked the police department for some help. And he carefully interviewed many detectives before he picked a select handful who would be his investigators. So he had a top-notch team.
Dewey always wanted to get the big boss, and everybody knew who the big boss was. It's Lucky Luciano. But the actual effort to prosecute him is a matter of circumstances and indirection.
While investigating loan sharking, Dewey stumbles across Lucky's supposed involvement in prostitution. It is the first tangible evidence he's found that can connect Charlie to a specific crime. He jumps at the chance to nail Lucky to a cross of hookers, but proof is hard to come by. No one's talking.
There's a man named Little Davy Patillo who worked under Luciano, who was apparently in charge of this particular underworld operation. Now, to enforce his authority, Little Davy would occasionally say that Charlie Lucky is behind this, or you will have to answer to Charlie Lucky if you don't do what I say. And from this, some people on the lower end of the line got the idea that Charlie Lucky was the boss, ultimately, of the whole prostitution racket.
In the spring of 1936, a warrant goes out for Luciano's arrest. When Lucky hears what is happening, he immediately flees to the one place where he thinks he won't be caught, Hot Springs, Arkansas, an open town almost literally created as a safe haven for gangsters.
So Dewey has to extradite him from Hot Springs. Not an easy thing to do. He sends a man, Ed McLean, down to Hot Springs and writes him a letter, a very revealing letter, which I found in the Manhattan District Attorney papers in the New York City Municipal Archives. In this letter, Dewey writes to Ed McLean, "As you know, we cannot directly relate Charlie Lucky as executive head of this operation. He did not directly place girls in these houses." So in this letter, Dewey essentially admits that he can't directly connect Luciano to this operation.
On April 1st, 1936, Lucky Luciano is arrested in a gambling casino in Hot Springs. Within the hour, thanks to local lawyers and a friendly judge, and before Dewey's men know what is happening, Luciano waltzes out of jail on a $5,000 bond. Dewey doesn't take this defeat lightly. He burns up the phone wires and persuades the Attorney General of Arkansas to intervene. Luciano is taken back into custody, and this time, the judge sets bail at $200,000. Lucky is quickly extradited to New York for trial. Convicting Luciano of a crime he may not have committed will take great perseverance and creativity, the kind Dewey is famous for. Can Luciano overcome this crusade against him, or is his luck about to run out? The case against Lucky Luciano is designed to prove that he is the power behind prostitution in New York City. As most of the 66 witnesses called are in the racket themselves, Dewey agrees not to press charges in exchange for their testimony against Lucky. Even though these women have no idea who their real boss is, they implicate Luciano, and Dewey is brilliant in the courtroom.
He really knew his way around a courtroom. He used his voice beautifully. He lost his temper only if it seemed effective to do so. And he persuaded the jury that Luciano was the guy.
In June 1936, after less than 24 hours of deliberation, the jury finds Lucky Luciano guilty.
That was the first remarkable thing. The second remarkable thing is the sentence he then receives. Judge McCook gives him 30 to 50 years for a prostitution rap that ordinarily would get a guy a couple of years in jail. The punishment is way out of proportion to the conviction, and the conviction itself was bogus.
I think this is a real case of the end justifies the means. The end was to rid society of Lucky Luciano.
The judge was doing something that is sometimes done by judges. He said, I'm not going to sentence him only for what we convicted him of. I'm going to sentence him for all the things we suspect him of being guilty of, and that we kind of know in our hearts that he's guilty of.
Luciano spends the next 6 years in jail at Dannemora Prison, known as Siberia in the underworld because of its location in northern New York State. Inside, Lucky lives a plush life. Little Davy Patillo, who was sent up with Lucky, cooks his meals, and other convicts are paid to do his work in the laundry. But as Dewey and others will learn, sending Lucky to prison does not curb his power.
He continued to run organized crime in this country from his prison cell, perhaps not as effectively as he would have had he still been here, but he was still the power.
From the time Luciano is sent away, his lawyers try to get him out, but he can't get an appeal through. He does not get a second trial. He just sits up there in Dannemora, yearning for New York City.
And then, of course, the most extraordinary set of circumstances arose that got him out.
December 7th, 1941, a day of infamy. Even as Japanese diplomats were conferring with Secretary of State Hull on peace measures, Nipponese planes were swooping down on Pearl Harbor.
World War II started, and the French ocean liner Normandy, the largest, most beautiful ship that France had produced, was tied up at the Hudson River piers. It was going to be converted into a troop ship.
And one night, it was set afire and sank to the bottom of the Hudson River, and everybody was totally appalled.
Suddenly, sabotage is a real concern for the U.S. Navy, and they realize that if they want the waterfront protected, they need to make a deal with whoever controls the docks. So ironically, the government that once set out to crush Lucky now seeks his help.
And a delegation of naval officers went up there, and they sat down and talked to Lucky. And Lucky said, well, if you don't want anything to happen to the ships, nothing will happen. All you have to do is to be nice to me. So the Navy cut a deal with the devil.
It's one of those marriages of convenience that happens in wartime. The point is to secure the docks, and the Navy doesn't care how it's done.
His war effort doesn't stop there. According to legend, in 1943, Lucky uses his contacts with local mafioso to ease the way for Allied troops during the invasion of Sicily.
He was an American patriot. He prided himself on being an American. And it was an amazing instance of cooperation between the military forces and the forces of crime.
The war is finally over, and Lucky waits impatiently for the government to make good on its part of the bargain. Luciano is eager to leave jail and make a triumphant return to his turf, New York City. But as he will soon discover, it's not Manhattan, but a new kind of purgatory that awaits him. February 1946. World War II has been over for 6 months, and Lucky Luciano remains in prison, waiting for the governor of New York to sign his parole papers.
And certainly there's a beautiful historical irony in that the man who put him in jail 10 years later is the guy who signs his pardon.
Thomas Dewey, now the governor of New York, clears the way for Lucky to leave jail. Publicly, he states that this is being done in recognition of Luciano's wartime service, but that may not be the whole story.
What I would speculate is that there was an element of personal guilt involved, that Dewey knew how much he played with the evidence to get the result he wanted, how unfair in some ways the incredibly long sentence given to Luciano was, and that there was some sort of personal redemption involved in the attempts he made for Luciano.
But pardoning a criminal like Lucky might put Dewey in an embarrassing position. He intends to mount another presidential campaign in 1948, and any negative publicity could hurt his chances. So he comes up with a brilliant solution to this prickly problem. Lucky will be released, but only if he signs a document accepting voluntary deportation to Italy. Lucky doesn't want to go into exile, but he has little choice. It's either remain in jail or leave America. So on February 9th, 1946, almost 40 years to the day that he first arrived in America, Luciano was put on a ship bound for Italy.
I guess he said to someone at one point, I came to the United States, I was 4 years old, 5 years old. What do I know about Italy? What do I know about Sicily? America's what I know. This is where I live. This is where that's my country.
Even as he settles in Naples, Luciano dreams of returning to America, and he takes steps to make the dream a reality. In 1947, after only 1 year in Italy, the Commission conspires to smuggle Lucky to a safe location as close to the U.S. as possible.
Cuba is only 80 miles from the shores of the United States. And what happened within 1 year? After his deportation, there's Lucky Luciano in Havana, Cuba, and Charlie, it's going to be just like the old days. You sit here and tell us what you want. It only takes a half hour to get on the plane and come over from Miami to Havana. Everything's great.
Cuba was the ultimate petri dish. Everything had been set environmentally perfectly there. There was gambling, it was a resort community, it was not in the United States. It had a small but easily corruptible and influenceable government, and, well, I mean, you can't get better circumstances for mob's influence to grow.
The mob is flourishing in Cuba, and with Lucky so close to home, it is the perfect place for the Commission to gather to discuss business.
The meeting of the Commission in Havana was Luciano's last hurrah.
Lucky intends to stay in Havana and run the mob from there, but this infuriates a federal official who is determined to see that Luciano is sent back to Italy.
Harry Anslinger is one of the heroes in the history of prosecution of the underworld. He's very unacknowledged. He was the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics from 1930. He was its founding director until the early 1960s. And he is the first important lawman to understand the mafia.
And he convinced the United States government to threaten Fulgencio Batista, the dictator of Cuba at that time, that we would cut off necessary medical supplies not produced in Cuba that they had to obtain from the United States. If you don't get rid of Luciano, we will cut off the flow of medicine and it'll be a disadvantage to your people.
In late February of 1947, under intense pressure from the U.S. government, Luciano is arrested, deported, and sent back to Italy, where he will live until his death.
When Luciano was in exile and unable to return, and therefore his hold over the empire that he created was effectively ended.
Without as dominant a leader as Lucky, the mob starts to fray at the edges. The government, spearheaded by Senator Estes Kefauver, begins an investigation of organized crime. And rivalries between families that had been buried for years suddenly emerge full-blown.
Everybody wanted to be the boss of bosses. Only none of them, not one, was as strong a figure as Luciano, or as perceptive as Luciano, or as forward-looking as Luciano.
Lucky would prefer to be in New York running the commission, not watching from afar as it begins to fall apart, but he knows that is impossible.
Certainly not while Anslinger was there. Certainly not while narcotics use and heroin use was increasing in the United States. And Anslinger blaming it all on him. I think he resigned himself to being there, and I think that made a change in his life. I had indicated that in his early life, he didn't get into any serious social commitment. He didn't get married the way his friends had. But now at this time in Italy, he married a very fine young woman. Igia Lissoni was her name.
And she was utterly devoted to Lucky Luciano. I often wondered if she knew his history and the things that this man had done. Lucky had gone straight, at least domestically.
Not only is there a change in his private life, but there is also a change in his career. Charles Luciano opens a restaurant.
I remember the first time I met Lucky Luciano because I was a naval officer at the time, and we used to go to Lucky Luciano's restaurant called the California. And it was the only place in Naples where you could get a good, solid American cheeseburger.
And some of those sailors, their biggest thrill was to ask if they could keep the menu and then stop at Luciano's table and ask him to autograph it, a big treasure that they would bring back from their service in the Sixth Fleet. He began to feel like a movie star.
In addition to the restaurant, Lucky opens a confetti candy factory and a tomato paste company. But government harassment causes both these ventures to fail.
When his tomato paste canning operation failed, he went and opened up a heroin pipeline. And as he told everybody, he said, I tried to go straight. And, I was going to give him the best Neapolitan tomato paste in the world. They all threw it back in my face.
With 2 failed businesses and cash running short, Charlie concentrates on what he knows best. He develops ties to the legal pharmaceutical industry in Italy and allegedly sets up a heroin route. From Italian processing plants to Cuba to America.
Seems clear enough that he is the man who arranges heroin shipments from Europe and other points to America. Harry Anslinger's Bureau of Narcotics has various undercover guys working with him, trying to penetrate it. They never get the evidence.
I don't believe Luciano was directly involved in the drug trade, but I can't ignore the fact that some of the people who went to visit him ostensibly to bring him a stipend were then later convicted of serious narcotics violations in the United States.
So it's very ironic that Lucky, who is still loyal to the old-time notion of the mafia, there in Italy is in charge of the traffic that eventually will be a large part of the undoing of the American mafia.
Lucky lives in luxury on the monthly payments he receives from New York, his cut of mob profits. But as the organization he built starts to self-destruct, payments to Luciano begin to shrink. For Lucky, that is the ultimate insult, because it means he is losing his grip, and it's about to get much worse.
January 1959, Havana goes wild. Fidel, our liberator, the crowds roar. Fidel, our savior.
Castro may have saved Cuba, but he mortally wounds the mafia by nationalizing their property and businesses in Havana. The mob's loss of income is staggering. It hits Lucky hard, too. There are fewer dollars to send his way. In Rome, Charlie meets an American movie producer, Martin Gosch, who persuades him to cooperate in making a film of his life.
He thought he could make some money out of it, and he thought it would be a very exciting gangster film. But the boys in New York didn't like it at all. And they sent word back that if he did the film, he'd be dead.
But Luciano was not a guy who could be threatened very easily.
Lucky does not cave in. In fact, he has the producer fly to Naples to work with him on the script.
It was about as normal a day as can be. He got up in the morning, he had breakfast, he went, saw some people, drove out to the airport to meet Martin Gosch at the airport. Martin got off the plane from Spain. They greeted each other, and Luciano had a heart attack and fell down dead. And as simple as that.
Was it a heart attack, or was he silenced before he could tell his story? If the latter, it was only business, nothing personal. Members of the commission loved Lucky Luciano for what he had done for them. But his contributions were in the past, and they wouldn't allow his story to be told. It would have been a blueprint for their own destruction. Lucky's movie was never made, and while he has been a character in many mafia movies, the true story of his life may never be seen on film.
Lucky Luciano was a master of manipulation, of organization, of using people and ideas. Was he a genius? No, I don't think so.
He managed to get very far and do very well and evade many pursuers. And I think a lot of that had to do with his instincts, his innate ability to judge men and circumstances, but a lot of it had to do with being lucky.
Luciano was sometimes described as the chairman of the Board of Crime of New York. What is certain is that he could never have become chairman of any other board of legitimate business. because organized crime is a world of flawed characters. And in that world, Luciano was a giant among pygmies. But to imagine that he could ever have been a brilliant success in the real world of honest, hard-working people is, to sound very old-fashioned, just out of the question.
Lucky's legacy as a criminal is very mixed. He's the guy who modernized the mafia, installed the commission, gave the mafia a new reach and stability and staying power. And then on the other end, he's the guy who helped cripple the mafia because he connects it to hard drug dealing, and hard drugs ultimately really damaged the mafia in ways that we should all be grateful for.
It was a hell of a legacy. In fact, it ruined this country.
The life and legacy of Charles Lucky Luciano is shrouded in legend and secrecy. Perhaps all the stories about him are true, perhaps none. We may never know for sure. Whatever his exact role in mob history, whatever crimes he may have committed, whatever he did in the name of patriotism and business, there is no question that Lucky Luciano deserves a prominent place in our rogues gallery.